We're both working for Eyes on Animals, which is an animal welfare organization that's registered in Holland, but we focus mainly on transport of farm animals and slaughter. So we've got volunteer inspectors and freelance inspectors that work pretty much all over Europe and in Turkey. Our aim simply is to reduce suffering now. So we try to take the theory and put it into practice, and also the legal requirements, putting them into practice. So we'll use the goodwill of industry to try to get positive changes in the slaughterhouses or in the trucks, but we'll also give training courses to police to make sure that legislation's better enforced. And Madelaine is an inspector for the organization since 1 year now.
Yes, since 1 year, and before I did some campaign work for other animal welfare organizations, and I also did a few inspections. But since I work for Eyes on Animals now, I did a lot of inspections already in 1 year.
I've been involved for a long time in trying to evaluate animal welfare in a scientific way and to try to clarify all the concepts, and that includes housing systems, transport, and slaughter methods. Most of my research has been on housing and transport, but I do spend a lot of time dealing with slaughter as well.
One of my first questions was the agreement among scientists on methods for gauging animal pain, because you hear debate over, for example, CO2 stunning versus electrical stunning, and some people think that CO2 stunning is not painful. Is there general consensus among the experts on the measurement of pain in animals?
I would say that there is general consensus on the assessment of pain. There are different kinds of measurements which can be made, but we are still learning about how to identify pain and assess it. It's easier in some species than others. For example, it's quite easy to tell that a human or a dog is in pain because they make a lot of noise. It's very hard to tell that a sheep is in pain because generally they don't make noise, and in fact it is to their disadvantage to make a noise if they're in pain if there is a predator present. So actually assessing pain is not always straightforward, but we've learnt a lot about it recently. For example, with sheep we've developed a methodology of looking at the expression on the faces, the grimace movement which is shown, very slight changes in the face, but it's proving to be a very useful indicator of the extent of pain in sheep. And obviously there's also difficulty to identify pain in fish, and it's harder generally in birds than in mammals because the things you can measure are different. But you can measure behavior and you can measure physiological changes which give you information about the extent of pain. That's been really important in trying to work out whether animals are in pain when they're supposed to have been stunned. If they're supposed to have been stunned but actually they're still feeling all the pain, then that can be a really bad thing.
I met Madelaine actually through this whole question of, is CO2 okay? And I had heard from many people in the industry that CO2 had advantages. And the reason I started getting interested in knowing more about it was Tesco a few years ago had published an article saying that they would like all slaughterhouses that supply pork meat to the Tesco supermarkets, at least in the UK, I don't know about the rest, would switch to a CO2 system, Paternoster CO2 system. And so I asked a slaughterhouse here in Holland if I could see it for myself, but you can't actually see the animals going through the CO2 at the highest level because they go down about 4 to 5 meters. So we installed cameras, and I met Madelaine through that because she had actually tested CO2 on herself, and maybe you can explain how you felt, and then I'll explain what we saw in the pigs.
Yes, I also wanted to know, I read a lot of research on this topic, so I just wanted to know for myself, how does it feel to breathe in CO2? And we tested it out by a CO2 stunning method that is used for piglets, so it's 70% CO2 first. It's a mask you put on your face. And well, I tried to breathe in the CO2, but it's almost impossible to keep it to your mouth because you, with all the power and all the strength you have, you want to get it away because it makes you really feel like you don't have air at all. So you do breathe in, but it's like there's nothing in there that you can use. So it's it feels like suffocation actually. Only the higher the concentration, the more you also felt like it was a little bit painful in your throat.
Burning.
But actually, what was the most horrible is that it feels like you can't breathe. You don't have air.
I agree with you that inhaling carbon dioxide at a high concentration is a really unpleasant thing to do. And now there have been studies on a whole range of different species of animals which show that they try very hard to avoid high concentrations of carbon dioxide. So if it's below about 20%, then there's less avoidance. But as soon as you get much more than that, then all of the main farm animals will strongly avoid carbon dioxide if they can. What we conclude from that is it's better to have an inert gas like argon than an aversive gas like carbon dioxide. I do think, though, that gas stunning methods are very good for pigs, for example, because you can move pigs along in a group. They can stay in a social group. They can be moved along into a container, and then the container lowered into the gas, and that means that the handling is very good. The handling is much better than you get if the pigs are going to be electrically stunned, which is the other major method for stunning pigs. But lowering them into the gas, then it depends what gas it is, because if it's an inert gas, they just become unconscious without showing any sign of awareness of being in the gas. But I've looked at hundreds of pigs which have been lowered into carbon dioxide, and they all show a very substantial response to it. They throw their head back, they gasp very conspicuously, they struggle, they move around, try very hard to get out of the place where the carbon dioxide is. But that doesn't last forever. It lasts for something like 30, 40, sometimes 50 seconds in the commercial systems that I've looked at. So I would say that gas stunning is a good thing, and I can understand where Tesco came from in saying we ought to move to gas stunning, but actually carbon dioxide is not the best gas.
I don't think we can say black and white that one system is always going to be more humane than other. I think CO2 will never have the potential to be welfare friendly, simply because even if the movement is easier, you can never get rid of that horrible feeling of breathing in CO2. Whereas electricity, which is the only alternative we have right now on the market, it can be improved. It has potential, but the potential hasn't really been sought out. Temple Grandin, she came out with quite a few designs. Like one of them we've seen now in Germany, and there's also a slaughterhouse in Canada that does it. I made a photo with Madelaine today. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a sort of corral system. So it's round, where the animals are guided in a semicircle, and then there's two entrances into the single file, and they can choose which one. And if you try to get them into the right entrance, then they of course want to go into the left, but that's fine. Then they go through the left system. But the choral movement, the movement of animals thinking that they're going back to where they came from, seems to really reduce the stress. And then the other slaughterhouse that we did, difficult to see, it's an offset step here they've made so that a pig can stand there and let the other one go in. Normally this is a diagonal, so the pig can't actually stand on the side to let this one go in, but it goes on the diagonal, and it ends up becoming a bottleneck at the entrance. But that's had some success at this quite large slaughterhouse in the eastern part of the country. But I think, Dr. Broom, you'll agree with us fully, the ideal situation would be as if we could find another gas that works, that's commercially viable, that's abundant. Like helium could work, but it's not abundant. We hear different things about argon gas, if it's possible, if it's economically viable. The point is, and what we're trying to do here in the Netherlands and in Germany, is to create pressure on industry to keep searching for a more humane gas, because for so long CO2 was accepted without really thinking, is it the best?
I do agree with you, Lesley, that the handling systems are crucially important for animals, and it's very good that there are efforts to try to make them better, whichever stunning system is used. We have, I think, a particular problem with poultry, because at the moment the way they are handled is that they are hung upside down on a shackling line by their feet, and that is a very disturbing thing to do. And if you can, instead of doing that, they're disturbed by the human presence, and they're disturbed by being put upside down, and also it doesn't always work. It works reasonably, but it doesn't always work well. The birds are sometimes not stunned. If they move at the wrong moment, they may not be stunned. So there are some major problems with poultry stunning, and if the birds are going instead into a gas, then that is much better for their welfare, and it's also the fact that it's better for their welfare is also reflected in the meat quality. The meat quality is better when they have the gas stunning systems than when they have the electrical stunning systems for poultry. But I do think that it is perfectly feasible to use argon. Now, the situation with argon is that argon is like carbon dioxide, present in the air which we are all breathing, and it can be extracted from the air. The actual cost of doing it is slightly greater for argon than for carbon dioxide, but the difference in the actual cost is small. The problem with the usage of these two gases is that at the moment, argon is being used, and there is a great demand for it for the steel industry. And as a result, the price of argon is inflated more than it ought to be, because there are a lot of people who want to use it in the steel industry. And that seems to be a reason why it's not being sufficiently produced for stunning of animals. But I think in the long run that it is the best gas to use. Now, nitrogen, there's variation amongst species in how animals react to nitrogen, whereas almost all animals seem to take no notice of argon. In other words, they become unconscious apparently without knowing that it's happening to them. Some species are disturbed by being in nitrogen, but nothing like as much as carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is directly aversive. Nitrogen is somewhat aversive in some circumstances for some species. So I think we should move to argon, and that's the way forward with both poultry and pigs.
Why do you think it's not yet in place for poultry? Also because it's too expensive? The industry is saying it's too expensive, or?
It is being used. There are some using it for poultry, but I think it's because the price of the argon is it's a bit higher than the carbon dioxide, so it's cheaper to use carbon dioxide. The total cost difference is very small when you look at the whole production of the animals. It's a very small amount of money, but if you're paying for a slaughterhouse, unless you're forced to change, I think they won't change.
But wasn't it the case that argon was difficult to mix with air?
Argon and carbon dioxide are heavy gases. They're about the same. The density is about specific gravity is about the same. So that means that if you put the gas into a chamber, then you can lower animals into that chamber, and it works for both of the gases. They're both heavy gases. So there isn't really a disadvantage in terms of that.
That means that they could technically keep the same equipment in the slaughterhouses as what they now have for CO2, but just replace CO2 with argon because it's also a heavy gas.
Yes.
When we talk to a very large slaughterhouse in Europe that has a lot of money and that says it's going to invest in research, when we talked about argon with them, though, they were worried that when the workers were to cut open the carcass, that the workers wouldn't detect the argon coming out of the lungs and may also lose consciousness. Was this just a silly excuse, or do you see also some risk of that?
No, that's not a silly excuse, because carbon dioxide will, as you have described, when you take in carbon dioxide you know, whereas with argon you don't know. So, and that's the reason why you can't use some other gases like carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is good for killing most animals, but it's so dangerous for people that it's not going to be used. It just means you have to design the equipment so that you don't have a problem of people actually getting into the place where the argon is. But the amount of argon which would be in the lungs of an animal would be extremely small in comparison with the volume of the air around. So I really don't think that that's a significant risk, because the argon's not toxic. So, and we are breathing argon all the time in very small quantities. The problem with argon is that the animal takes longer to die or it takes longer to become unconscious in argon than in carbon dioxide. So you have to leave them in there for a bit longer. And that means you've got to design the apparatus in such a way that you leave them for a couple of minutes longer.
That may also be what makes the industry hesitate to switch to it or to even be open to argon, because for us, what they're telling us is argon is not possible. We have to keep looking, but maybe it's an economic factor. Argon is a bit more expensive, and then if the animals have to stay a bit longer, then you're going to have, instead of 10,000 pigs being slaughtered per day, then maybe only 8,000, which is still something to play around with the industry. It can't all come down just to money, but I guess that's one of the hinders.
Okay, so I think this is an area where there's been a significant and useful development in that, first of all, we now have really good evidence that when an animal's throat is cut without it being stunned beforehand, that there is a period of extreme pain. And this has been found out by recording from the brain, and it's absolutely clear now that that's the case. And the time that it takes is not, it's up to about 2 minutes in cattle and poultry, and usually 20 to 40 seconds in sheep. Generally, they're not killing pigs by that method. That's a significant amount of time to have extreme pain. There's started to be a quite rapid move in a number of countries, and I'd like to know how you're seeing it at the moment in halal slaughter. So the Muslim world is moving to having stunning occurring within 5 seconds of the throat being cut, and that means that the animals are going to be are not going to have that significant period of pain. And so in halal slaughter, I understand in the UK it's now 75% of halal meat is produced with a stun within 5 seconds of the cut. And I've just been I've been to a number of Asian countries recently and talked to people about it, and they're interested in this, and I think there's a potential for that to happen more and in more countries. So far in Jewish shechita slaughter, they haven't changed, or hardly anybody has changed to my knowledge. But I think there is a real sign of change in the Muslim world.
Well, what we've seen here in Europe, or at least in Belgium, where we've been to some halal slaughterhouses, they're also doing post-stunning at 3 of the plants. And there's a few halal slaughterhouses here in Holland that are allowing even pre-stunning. So it always depends on the local imam and the discussions that the slaughterhouses have had with the religious authorities in that local area. And that is, in a sense, how halal works. The same thing in Turkey. You can go from one imam to the next, and they'll have different opinions. But Turkey, which is mainly where we work, a little bit in Egypt, it's difficult because even though some imams don't have such a problem with stunning, other ones really do. It all comes down to the religious authorities in Ankara. And our experience with them, we had 2 of our Turkish volunteers there in December, is they're not very much aware of the science. And it really takes a lot of discussion to even get one step forward, because there's been such a myth that has been spread about halal, about stunning, that it's difficult to change their minds quickly. A lot of them are really insistent that it's not halal if you stun the animal. And I think it's important that we get the information to them, and that more things be published in Arabic and Turkish. That's the #1 thing that we often ask researchers, is try to get their research published in the languages that are used by countries that have a lot of halal production. So Arabic and Turkish and Persian. Yeah.
A really key thing for both halal and shechita, for Jewish and Muslim people, is that if the animal is stunned, they want to make sure it is alive at the point that the religious ritual cutting occurs. Yeah. They want to be sure that it hasn't been killed by the stunning method, and there is actually a need for reassurance that this is possible, that the methods which are used for stunning do not kill the animal. Another thing that's important, I think, is there is the idea that the animal doesn't bleed, that the blood doesn't come out properly if the animal has been stunned. That is completely wrong. But it is still said by some people, well, we don't want to have this carcass and eat it because it hasn't bled properly, because the animal was stunned. But actually, when you stun the animal, it doesn't mean that less blood comes out. That's completely erroneous.
Yeah, often it can mean that more blood is coming out. If an animal's calmer, then its heartbeat is at a normal rate where it can be filled up, and properly have enough blood to get out. Whereas if an animal's totally stressed before being cut, the heart is beating so fast that it often doesn't fully fill up with blood to get it out. That's what we heard from some slaughter manufacturers, and I can believe it. In Turkey, we see animals that are so in panic that they're breathing really fast, their heart is pumping, their skin is pumping, that a lot less blood seems to be coming out from them, from the stress.
But so, Lesley, the reason why so many animals travel through Europe towards Turkey and Middle East is because they have to be slaughtered the halal way there? It's not done in Europe?
No, well, with Turkey, they're importing a lot of breeding animals as well. They're trying to create their own herds so that they're not so dependent on other countries. But it's also Europe. Europe really wanted to export animals to Turkey because we've got a surplus of dairy animals, basically dairy cattle. And our beef mainly comes from breeds like Charolais or Limousin. And the dairy calves are of lower quality. So we sell them to Lebanon. Lower quality, I don't know if that's the right word, but they're not the good quality beef animals. So you can't find a market as easily for them. But the Lebanese and the Egyptians and the Turkish were willing to buy the surplus. So there was a good deal that was made. So we're sending mainly our surplus dairy cattle over there for slaughter and the females for breeding.
What are some of the overall positive and negative trends you see within the slaughterhouse industry?
I think one positive trend which is occurring in a number of places now is that they are putting video cameras in the slaughterhouse. And this means that the people who are handling the animals and the people who are actually carrying out the slaughter procedure are aware that there is a camera. And even if the camera is not on all the time, it makes people behave better if they might be observed by a camera. And it seems to me that it's something which really significantly improves animal welfare, and we actually should have legislation to say that all slaughterhouses should have video.
Absolutely.
Yes, we agree. We are also in contact with many slaughterhouses here in the Netherlands and try to convince them to install cameras. Here is a picture of one of them. So it's really used. And it's also really effective, huh? Yeah,
we've gone to quite a few slaughterhouses in Holland installing them and also in Belgium. But when we go to slaughterhouses, we always give certain recommendations, and one of them is exactly what you just said, CCTV surveillance. If you know you're being filmed, you're always going to pay more attention to what you're doing. But also, even if the screen is not always being watched by the director or the boss, if the authorities from the government come, they can request to watch some footage from the day before. They have to hold on to that footage for a certain amount of time. So I think that gives a lot better chance for proper surveillance. But the other thing we try to do is tell bosses they have to set the standard at their slaughterhouse. If you've got a bad manager, you're going to have bad animal welfare. So the onus is really on the manager. He needs to show that welfare is important, but he also has to give bonuses or give a compliment to his workers that are working hard, and let's admit it, it's not the nicest or easiest job, and say you did a good job. And create an atmosphere in the slaughterhouse that's professional and where you're respected for doing the job that you're doing. And then I think people will also treat animals better.
Would you say that currently the level of inspection by the government in the slaughterhouses is not sufficient, is not enough?
I think when the government goes to a slaughterhouse, there's a bell where everyone's warned, government inspectors are here, and the speed of the slaughter line is reduced. I'm not saying all slaughterhouses are doing this, but we meet with a lot of people from the industry, with the lower workers, with the truck drivers, and we hear their side of the story. And there's definitely a warning that goes out in most slaughterhouses when government inspectors show up. So again, CCTV camera would be ideal. I know that El 214, a very good French organization, they've got footage. I don't know who hung up the cameras, but they hung up cameras in certain slaughterhouses. Someone that knows El 214 in any case, and they got horrendous footage inside 2 slaughterhouses in France. And we've been unannounced to slaughterhouses in Holland, especially the smaller ones, which aren't always well supervised. And we've seen really bad things, even in so-called animal-loving Holland.
I entirely agree with what you just said, and there certainly are people who are behaving very badly and treating animals badly in some slaughterhouses. My impression is that the average has been improving in most countries, and that is partly because of government action, but it's more to do with the increased connectedness of the industry. That is, you have a farmer producing, animals being transported, animals being handled in the slaughterhouse, and then the meat being sold. If the animal has been treated badly, then you get a lot of you get poorer meat quality. You get bruises, you get cuts, you get changes in the meat, pale, soft, exudative meat, dark, firm, dry meat, and these are more likely to occur if the welfare of the animals is poor. So the more you have a connection between what happens on the farm, where the animals are loaded into a vehicle, offloaded from a vehicle, handled in the slaughterhouse, all of those procedures, if they're all connected, then there is an incentive for people to do the job better, and that generally means better welfare for the animals. I
do understand that argument. In practice, we still are surprised by how much suffering we see and still so much meat being produced. So much spices get added to their meat, and their meat gets grounded up with other parts, that in a hamburger, you don't really realize that actually some of that meat may be DFD in it. It's, you know, you add the flavor to it to camouflage a lot of the welfare problems that are happening and are influencing the meat quality. And I think industry will always find a use for even poor quality meat.
What practices in general do you think are most problematic in the farming industry?
Probably the worst animal welfare problem in the world is for broiler chickens, because there are enormous numbers and a rather high proportion of them still have major leg disorders. And then the second worst is now milking cows. And I think the welfare of milking cows has become worse and worse in the last 20 years. It's steadily got worse because of increased, if you have very high milk yield, then you have increased amounts of mastitis, leg disorders, and reproductive disorders. And the evidence for that is absolutely clear. But in the industry, people are still pushing for higher milk yields. Cows strongly prefer to be able to graze in the fields if they can. They won't give up food altogether in order to do that, but they have to still get good enough food. But we have a tendency to have more and more cows which are kept inside buildings all of their lives, and that means that their needs are not met as well as an animal which is able to go out and graze.
I strongly feel we need to really rethink the way we eat and how much. Not against meat or dairy per se, but we cannot continue this way. Not with the amount of antibiotics we give, and not with the amount of land we use, and not with the number of animals we have, because it's really gotten out of hand, and we're becoming used to having cheap meat, plentiful meat.
What do you feel are some of the most successful pathways to bring about this reform? Is it direct consumer pressure on the producers, or is it nonprofits working to enact or enforce legislation?
Both of those things. I think it has been the case that animal protection societies have often been able to influence the public or provide information for the public, and that's been a very valuable thing to do. And also, as you were just saying, Lesley, to advise the companies and give them information which helps them to make their operation more efficient and more acceptable to the outside world. But I think in the long run, the biggest changes which have occurred in the last 20 years have occurred because retail companies, supermarket and fast food companies are setting standards, and they are enforcing them. And they have more money to do the enforcement than government has.
Absolutely.
There are more inspections coming from the supermarket companies than from government. In the UK, at the moment, there has been a significant cut in the number of people who are inspecting anything because of the financial crisis that started in 2008, because of the stupidity of the banks having to be bailed out. So government staff go up and down according to how affluent the country is, but the supermarkets can't afford to be shown up by their clients, their customers, and so they are doing the inspections, and they are having a valuable effect of improving animal welfare.
And you can support the good farmers, because there definitely are some good people, good farmers, and even people who work in the transport sector that are different, that do want to do their best. They're the minority according to us, but they deserve our support. If not, they'll stay the minority, and we hope they'll be the majority. What a nice ending.
Yes.